the palace, the public opinion polling. Her public opinion is recovered a lot. There is a ways to go. But you look back historically on the queens, you know, some of the queens, they were very popular because, you know, there would be vicious rumors passed around about them, you know, and they didn't have any Instagram, they had no Facebook that they could counter with rumors.
Yeah. Some of them were rumors. I was just reading about
some of them were true.
Mary, Queen of Scots, the Bloody Mary, had thousands and thousands of people executed.
You're kidding.
No. Was she the one that also had the boyfriend Rizzo that ended up being killed at the Palace of Holyrood House? I think.
That I didn't know.
She had a boyfriend. He was a member of the court. So he had access to their royal bedchambers.
Shake your head.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
Queen Camilla. Yes, Queen Camilla.
Well, we mentioned Queen Elizabeth then, so.
Yeah, and the fact of the day is there's two types of queens in Great Britain, as you probably already know. There's a queen consort, and there's a queen regnant. The queen regnant reigns because she was born to be queen. The queen consort is married to a king. But there's no king consort. So Queen Elizabeth, Philip could never be king consort because king supersedes queen. So therefore, he was Prince Philip his whole life. I knew you had to know that.
Yeah. Hey, Mike.
What was Albert? What was his designation?
He was a prince consort.
Prince consort.
And Queen Victoria had to fight like everything in the 1830s to get that for him because they didn't like that very much.
Because Tara really enjoyed the PBS thing on Victoria and Albert.
Isn't that serious?
Yeah, it was really, really interesting. I didn't watch much of it, but. All right, welcome to First Universalist Church of New Madison on this sunny but windy and cold day. It is still February, so no complaints. It could be worse. The snow is pretty much melted. And my understanding is from looking at the future forecast, it's supposed to be 60 degrees next week.
Yeah.
So that's pretty incredible.
Just one day.
Just one day, but even one day means you go out and get a tan.
28 days till spring, though.
Yep. Any announcements? We want to wish Dolly her 87th birthday and many happy returns, and hope she'll be back with us again. She's out today. And also we want to mention, this is kind of joys and concerns, we want to throw it in the beginning. Queen Elizabeth, numerous people have remarked, I've seen on the news this morning, has COVID.
Yeah.
And you would think for the one person in the world, not the one person, but one of the people in the world, they would be the most guarded and the most careful around. So this thing is very, very infectious, even when people are taking all the precautions. So I want to encourage you, and it is not as severe as the previous iterations of the virus, but I want to encourage you to wear your mask, wash your hands, and protect yourself, because it still is putting people in the hospital. It's still killing people, particularly people who have not been vaccinated and who've not taken the correct precautions. We had our church board meeting last week, multiple discussions. One of the most interesting is if you listen to on Facebook, which if you're watching on Facebook, you're obviously aware of this, the microphone that we added picks up the voices so you can understand and hear the voices, but then it magnifies the piano to where it almost reverberates and doesn't have a true sound to it. So we're going to try a few different fixes for that. Probably put a little insulation on the back would be the simplest one, and we'll see if that works.
This is a loud piano, no matter what you do.
Uprights tend to be pretty loud anyway. So, and also when they're played with verve. Some people have real soft fingers, and other people don't. So yes. All right. Any other announcements? No. Okay. Our prelude is "This Is My Song," 159. If you want to follow along in the words, or 318. I think 159 is the actual "This Is My Song." actually we've talked about this before, this could almost be an anthem for UUs. My country skies are bluer than the ocean, and sunlight beams on clover leaf and pine, but other lands have sunlight too and clover. Remember we talked last week about Sinclair Lewis, his little quote about he knows the United States is just like every other country in the world, nothing to really distinguish it, and yet, contradictorily, he really loves the United States, and as much as a realist as Sinclair Lewis was, and maybe a little bit of a pessimist, he looked at the people around him in the small towns and was discouraged by their actions. He still really cared for and loved the United States and what the United States stood for, and that also is a UU tradition. We want the United States to live up to the Founding Fathers' ideals of what the United States should be, not what we are, but what we should be. As we kind of follow along on that theme, this is February's Black History Month. Everybody always gets a chuckle. The black people get the shortest month in the year to honor them. And to do that, we're going to do a little bit of research on black history today. I started out doing the actual understanding of Black History Month, but I kind of got sidetracked and funneled into critical race theory as I started out, so this is going to be mostly a little discussion on critical race theory. But before I do that, remember I told you last week I was going to bring you some quotes every week that I just found pretty amazing and sometimes funny and sometimes very sad. This one is just interesting, tinges on the crazy side. If you know who Sidney Powell is, that's our previous president's personal lawyer who represented him to the country. And Sidney has been involved in a lot of other things since the inauguration and since things have gone on. She sent out a new plea for cash this morning. This was like 2 days ago, saying that she has heard stories the Capitol Police opened the doors to the building when the protesters were there January 6th and fired tear gas behind the people to force them into the Capitol. And she needs more money to further investigate this claim. This is the kind of thing that we're dealing with on a day-by-day basis. All right, part of this picture here is a picture of urban renewal, primarily stimulated by the interstate system, the interstate highway system. And as I'm sure all of you are aware, somehow when the interstate highways went through the cities, they tended to go through the black neighborhoods. The rationale was they were getting rid of slums and giving people better housing, but what they did was they broke up thriving actual communities of people that had worked together and lived together and built up a cohesive neighborhood. These were all destroyed. So we'll kind of go into that as we go along. Our chalice lighting for our collective liberation by Deanna Vandiver. We light this chalice, symbol of our faith alive in this world, naming our vision of collective liberation, daring to remember each other into beloved community. That would be the verb. We want to make each other members in our beloved community. Our opening hymn, 148, Let Freedom Span Both East and West. span both east and west. Topical, goes right with what we're talking about today. Okay, our children's story is kind of an overview from a children's point of view of Birmingham, and I have a little presentation if it comes up. Kids Talk Black History.
Black History Month is a commemoration, vocab word, for black activists, another vocab word, who took their time out to go fight for what they feel is right. Like
Martin Luther King had a speech that violence is not the answer and no segregation.
we celebrate black people that helped us change history.
It reminds us to be strong, even in politics.
What matters is what's inside of you and how you act to other people.
Doesn't matter if you're black, if you're white, just always celebrate it because you know the struggles black leaders went through in order for you to be here right now.
Even though we may have the different skin color, we're still the same type of people, no matter what.
And a lot of people, they don't see me for who I am. They see my outside appearance, but they don't see what I have for leaders. It's very hard to grow up knowing that you're black and you have a lot of personal prejudice against you.
I see it on the TV and I'm like, is that going to happen to my brother? Is that going to happen to my dad? And I always have that in the back of my mind every time that I'm home and they're not home.
Black history is important to me because I have to remember where I came from and I have to remember who came before me.
Because we have to look at the things that Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X did for us black people, so people can't treat us unfairly because they think some type of belief. Because we are all people, and we need to stand up for our rights.
There's still discrimination. There's still discrimination in all parts of the world, in all parts of the United States. We should still fight for what we believe in. We should still fight for getting what's right.
Out of the mouths of babes. All right. In 1963, the civil rights movement had grown into a national movement. Many sit-ins at lunch counters, voter registration drives, freedom on interstate buses. And school districts had accepted, many school districts had accepted desegregation, but there was fierce resistance in a number of states, including Alabama. Governor George Wallace and a number of officials in local locales vowed to resist. He had just become governor, and his inaugural speech contained these memorial and memorable words. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He would be proven wrong, but it took several years of determined effort to overcome Alabama white supremacist power structure. In 1963, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they took the nonviolent approach to social change, and that was basically the guiding rule that everybody was following. They decided in '63 it was time to attack segregation head on and to do it to the center of segregationist resistance. Then we come to Birmingham. Bull Connor, Birmingham's Commissioner of Public Safety, was a determined segregationist. When the SCLC finally launched its campaign, he put up a wall of resistance. The campaign started with mass meetings and direct action. Dr. King talked endlessly about the philosophy of nonviolence and its methods, gathered volunteers for sit-ins, marches, and boycotts. The number of volunteers increased each day. There were kneel-ins at churches, sit-downs at the library, and a march on the county building to mark the opening of a voter registration drive. On April 10th, the city government got a court injunction ordering an end to all protests, but Martin Luther King Jr. and SCLC disobeyed the court order, declaring, "We cannot, in all good conscience, obey such an injunction which is unjust, undemocratic, and unconstitutional, a misuse of the legal process. King himself knew he would be arrested if he kept on going. They were running out of money. King was good at fundraising, but he wondered if he could do more on the outside than the inside. But finally he decided he had to go to jail. Friends, he said, I have to make a faith act. I don't know what will happen or what the outcome will be. I don't know where the money will come from. On April 12th, he was arrested for violating the court order, put into solitary confinement. He was not even allowed to call his wife, Coretta, who was at home recovering from giving birth. Attorney General Bobby Kennedy and President John F. Kennedy had to put pressure on the judges personally just so he could call home. After a huge movement all across the country to raise money, Dr. King was released on April 19th. During his time in jail, Dr. King recognized how big the movement was becoming. It wasn't about just the Deep South, although that's where the oppression was the worst and had lasted the longest. This was about the freedom of black people all across the country. In his famous letter from the Birmingham jail, he wrote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds." But change didn't happen just because he was released, and that's where the children came. The grown-ups in the movement wanted to keep the pressure. They wanted things to change, so they asked high school students to get involved. They had no idea what a lion they were releasing. 2 weeks after King's release, more than 1,000 black children came together to protest in Birmingham, Alabama. 900 were arrested. The next day, 2,500 more took their place. And Bull Connor, still in control, couldn't stand it. He kept his people under control until then, much as he hated it. But now, he ordered the firefighters to turn their hoses on the protesters. He told the police to let their dogs loose and chase the children down. In pictures that were broadcast and printed all over the country, nonviolent protesters were being seen beaten by angry police officers. Children were driven into the ground. John Lewis said, "We didn't fully comprehend at first what was happening. We were witnessing police violence and brutality, Birmingham style." Unfortunately for Bull Connor, so was the rest of the world. Agreements started to be made, pledges for desegregation of public accommodations, more fair and hiring practices, better communication between black and white leaders. But the white racists couldn't tolerate that. The home of Dr. King's brother was bombed. Another bomb was planted near the motel where King was staying. And Sunday at 9:45 at the 16th Street Baptist Church, a bomb exploded and killed 4 little girls in Sunday school. It was a national issue now. It was time for everyone, young and old, rich and poor, to join in solidarity together. On August 28th, 1963, more than 200,000 demonstrators showed up in Washington, D.C., and marched to the Lincoln Memorial. That's where Martin Luther King gave the speech that everyone remembers, about a dream of his that became the dream of everyone. All right, a quick overview. Our affirmation: The Deep Well of Black Lives by Kristen L. Harper. On August 25th, 1619, the ship, the White Lion, arrived at Point Comfort, now known as Fort Monroe National Monument in Hampton, Virginia. The ship contained enslaved Africans. This is the first recorded arrival of Africans in America. This year, this anniversary was commemorated at Fort Monroe as a day of healing and reconciliation. The community was asked to ring bells at 3 o'clock for 4 minutes, signifying the 400 years that have passed since that historic moment. How do we mark that first day, that hour, that minute? The White Lion docked at a point that would be of no comfort to the 20 enslaved Africans chained in her bowels, heralds of a coming storm of millions whose bodies would break through soil and rock to build an America that could never fully embrace its progenitors. How do we mark that day, that hour, that minute that foreshadowed the centuries of degradation and violence, of attempts to separate the soul and spirit from the deep well of Black lives? How do we mark that day, that hour, that minute 400 years ago when the first drop of African sweat commingled with the earth's warm planting of seeds, of a new culture, a new way of life, a new heartbeat into the fabric of a new world, when the roots of freedom sparked deep underground and spread from generation to generation, blossoming into resistance and resilience. So today we will ring bells of sorrow, bells of grief, bells of atonement. We will ring out the ghosts of those lost in the middle passages, lost to the whips and deprivation, lost to the lynches and bullets, lost to the prisons and chains of racism. Today we will ring bells so that tomorrow we may ring in freedom, ring in liberation. Joys and concerns. Queen Elizabeth, obviously, and I guess we need to include anyone who is suffering the ravages of COVID, whether it's a mild case or a death-dealing case. We are with all those people who are suffering. One thing nobody talks about too much, but if you look in the news, you'll see hints and whispers of it. There's something called the long haul COVID. People who get a mild case and then have symptoms that go on for weeks, sometimes even months. And I'm not sure if some of these people have ever ended. I've not really seen the information on that. You'll have headaches, fatigue, sweats, basically the symptoms of the flu that never go away. These symptoms, even though supposedly you've recovered from COVID and are back to your normal life, these lingering symptoms hang with you and basically make your life miserable as it goes along. So even for those people who say, oh, it's just like the flu, I'll get it and get over it, it's not always that simple. Take precautions, don't get it. Just don't get it in the first place. Any other joys or concerns, Mike?
Let's keep hopefully resolution, or at least some degree of diplomacy to prevent Russia's aggression toward Ukraine, and to save those poor individuals, spare them the ravages of war in Ukraine.
Yes, President Biden, with his security information, has said Putin has already decided to invade. It's just a question of when. It's pretty hard to believe in this century that we're looking at war again with a giant nation invading another nation to impose their will on it. I thought we had gone past that, but obviously I guess we haven't. And the question is, what is the response? The United States has said we will not send troops. We're sending material and supplies, and all of the NATO allies are sending material and supplies, but that is not going to be enough. So the question now is kind of settled on what the Ukrainian people will do. Will they acquiesce? Will they just roll over? Or will they stand up for themselves? Which, if they do, that creates bloodshed in an unbelievable amount, which we don't want to see. So I have not decided. I'm indecisive. I'm indeterminate on what the correct response would be. Russia's been threatened with sanctions, and we all know that they don't care much about that, so we'll find out and see. The one complicating point is, if you've heard about the gas line from Russia into Germany, Russia has supplied natural gas to Western Europe for the last 20 or 30 years and increased the amount all the time of the amount of gas they supply. If they cut that supply off, what happens to Western Europe? I have not heard anybody's suggestions other than liquid natural gas, LNG, which the United States produces, but we do not produce enough to supply all of Western Europe. But something needs to be done to give them heat in the winter and cooking gas so they can make their meals without relying on Russia. That would definitely hurt Russia. Anything else? There are many ills. There's still fires, there's still floods, there's snowstorms, there's hurricanes, high winds in Britain. These things are all increasing because of global warming. So we want to keep all the people suffering from natural disasters also in our thoughts and prayers. For those things we've not mentioned, we'll light a few candles here. If you have a concern or a problem that we can help you with, even if you just want somebody to talk to, we have people here that will listen, and we have availability or access to Derek, the pastor at El Dorado, will do pastoral calls for us. So if you have something you need to talk to a pastor about, don't hesitate to contact us. All right, our offering music will be Lift Every Voice and Sing, which evidently is the NFL theme song, that's news to me, so we'll see how that works out. Put something in if you need, if you can, if you like. Take something out if you need as well. Missing a slide somewhere. Okay, we'll do without that one. All right, Black history. Let's start out by talking about the hobgoblin, the danger that everyone is talking about, critical race theory. Critical race theory is a way of thinking about America's history through the lens of racism. It examines how the legacy of slavery and segregation in the U.S. is embedded in the modern day legal system and policy. It is the idea that racism is not a matter of individual bigotry, but is systemic in American history, not a matter of individual bigotry. Keep that in mind. It's systemic in American history, but not a matter of individual bigotry. First, scientists say race is a social construct, not a scientific fact. I'm sure many of you are aware of that science said there is no such thing as race when you look at people, at human beings. But this is where things get complicated. Whoopi Goldberg got into trouble for saying Jews are not a race. You remember Hitler said, talked about the Jewish race all the time. And Whoopi Goldberg on The View said that that was incorrect. Jews are not a race. It was white people against white people. And of course, everybody jumped on Whoopi, saying that she was denigrating and demeaning the Jews by saying they were not a race, which is backwards because scientists say there is no race, and they are not an obvious looking race. So it's one of those complicated things where the society and what people think is the right thing to do causes trouble with everybody else. Okay, she got trashed for speaking the obvious. We all recognize the difference between blacks, Asians, American Indians, East Indians, and yet science says there is no valid race. What is it then? How do formally colorblind laws end up with discriminatory effects? The theory is the intersection of race, class, gender, and disability. They meld together with the unconscious bias in our minds, in everyone's minds, to bend the interpretation of these colorblind laws. Critical race theorists believe that racism is an everyday experience for most people of color, and that a large part of society has no interest in doing away with it because it benefits the major part of society, which is the white part of society. Critical race theory examines the intersection of race and law in the United States. Note, critical is used in the conceptual context, not the blaming sense. We're not saying critical thinking meaning we're blaming anybody. We're saying critical thinking is what we should be teaching in school, to observe a statement or problem from various viewpoints and determine what makes sense. Determine what is logical and what matches the facts of the situation at hand. Think of critical thinking as regular old thinking with a boost of concentration. Don't just assume. Don't take for granted. Don't just follow the reasoning of the old days, of the things you were taught at home or the things you learned at home. Actually examine the situation and let the confirmable facts lead to your inevitable conclusions. So, anyway, CRT includes such anomalies as the Constitution of the United States declaring that slaves only counted as 3/5 of a person. Why? This gets pretty confusing too. At the Constitutional Convention, some in the South wanted all slaves counted to maximize the number of representatives. In other words, if every slave counted as a person, even if they couldn't vote, the South got more representatives in the Congress, which means the South had more weight. Others in the South wanted slaves considered to be property and not persons at all. But as the states contributed to the federal government based on their wealth, and that wealth at that time was measured by property, no one could agree on whether slaves were property and taxed or citizens and who voted even though they couldn't vote. The 3/5 compromise was a result. So, and that's, the interesting thing is, the North wanted every slave counted, not for legislative purposes, but because each slave that counted as a person meant more wealth, and that's the more money that the South contributed to the federal government. The North wanted the South to contribute a fair share. What they ended up with was, instead of counting people, they ended up counting property, figuring that any property that was valuable, in other words, if you had bottomland that was growing lots of cotton or lots of crops, there were lots of people there to work on it. So if the property was valuable, there were more people there heretofore or afterwards, then you would have more money involved in the taxing basis. It's pretty complicated, and I still don't understand because of the competing factors. No one has been able to explain it to me, or I've not been able to find it. In the South, they were two factions balanced against each other, the faction that wanted all the slaves counted, and then the faction in the South that didn't want them to count because they weren't really people. They didn't count them as individuals. So, and that's how this compromise basically came about, is nobody could agree on one answer or another, so they kind of split the difference. Okay, as we are discussing, racism and law intersect. Here is another late example. When the interstate highway system was built in the 50s and 60s, the route through cities was critical. Whose houses, businesses, and churches would be erased to make way for the freeways? Who had the least power? Who lived in the most unsightly neighborhoods? Once again, racism and the law as eminent domain came together to scatter established black communities to the winds. And all this was done with completely neutral, race-neutral laws and regulations. But these guidelines were carried out by regular people, some of whom had agendas, and some of whom just did not know what the results would be of their actions. And some maybe who were just blind to the whole situation. So what are we to believe? Is racism extinct in America? We had a black president, and then therefore some people will say there is no more racism. Are we past the time to worry about equality, opportunity? Are we surrounded by examples of kumbaya, of colorblindness, of each treated as an individual? Or should we look at the news? Or do we observe it in our everyday lives? This is the real problem. Judgments and the resulting actions show us every day there is some kernel of truth in all the stereotypes. My wife criticizes my offhand opinions of criminal mugshots on the evening news. You, I'm sure, have seen those too. They display an attitude of supercilious nonchalance, nose in the air, head tipped back, a defiant glare in the eyes. That is a stereotype, but it tells you, in my mind, at least by my experience and my history, that is a person who is a criminal, and they are broadcasting their criminality by the pose and the face they make when the police take the mugshot. A non-verbal guilty plea, if I ever saw one. Is that any more racist than markedly locking the car doors as we proceed down Salem Avenue? My wife criticizes me for my racist observations, but when we drive down 49, as we approach Salem Avenue, she makes a point of reaching over and hitting the lock button so all the doors are locked. Is that racism or is that reality? All right. Having suspicions and acting on them are two different things. You are not condemned, at least by me, for having thoughts, for asking questions, for wondering what if. These individual thoughts are not to be confused with social actions. Actions of a group of like-minded individuals who codify and formulate rules that reflect these assumptions. Higher priced car loans and insurance, poor quality of health care, denial of business and real estate loans, discrimination in hiring and promotion, these are all commonplace and symptoms of social racism. History is full of examples of equal resumes rejected because of cultural questionable name. Are we punishing the parents because they name their kids Shaquan or Danica? Does having a culturally distinct name relegate one to a distinct, defined class strata? You've all seen the courses of people who have exactly the same resumes and distribute it to different companies. If they have a black name, they're never called in for an interview. If they have a white name, they're called in and hired. The exact same resume, tests and samples run by college experimenters. And this is all around the country. It doesn't matter where you are. Does the black culture's attention to appearance and elegance and dress mark them as separate? The Jews, the Irish, the Poles, the Italians, they all immigrated as minorities. They banded together to elect political dominance in a certain community and went on to blend into the larger culture. But there is something about a defiant display of difference that puts us on edge, a visual warning that others are among us. Something about that innate human tribal thing that came from thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. A burqa, dreadlocks, long side locks, called payats, if you didn't know, that the fundamentalist Jews wear, the little ear curls. Sagging pants are just some of the more striking visual clues that these are different folks. And there is something about looking different that makes you act different. Something about looking different, being different, that makes you act different. When I was hitchhiking around the West after college, I blended in with Levi jacket, Levi pants, cowboy boots, and a cowboy hat. But as I worked my way east and flew to Europe and then hitchhiked around Germany, I was wearing the same clothes. And what I found was I didn't change my appearance until I settled in Berlin some months later. So I thumbed through Reykjavik, Belfast, and Amsterdam with my orange backpack, attracting not just a few strange looks. This was on the road in the 60s and 70s, early 70s, so it wasn't totally unusual. There were hippies on the road everywhere at that time, but it did give me the sensation of being a stranger in a strange land. And there are two ways to react. You can become defiant, and this is who I am, and I don't care what you think or what you say, or you can play the chameleon and begin to blend in. I traded my boots and my jeans and my hat for slacks, loafers, and 3-button sweaters in Berlin, and pretty soon I was indistinguishable from the normal urban rider on the U-Bahn as I traveled back and forth to work. I felt comfortable hiding in the crowd. Is that our criticism of others? The different ones? They don't seem to want to fit in. They don't seem to want to be one of us. They want to remain different. Can we accept that? Can we accept their choice of wearing dreadlocks or a burqa? Are they wearing it for religious prescription? If they have the burqa, something they don't really have a choice in if they want to follow their faith? Or is it a personal choice, like the droopy sagging pants or the dreadlocks, or some of the black hairdos, which just escape me with the spikes and all that stuff going on? That is a cultural thing. It sets them apart, and some are obviously proud of it, but they are defiantly proud of it. What happened with the old cultures of the Italians, the Poles, the Jews, the Germans, who emigrated to America and blended in and became what we call today standard Americans? They are the white supremacist race, all of these cultures, because America was founded by immigrants. The Native American Indians are also set apart, and they are not the dominant controlling factor in America now. So, complicated question. I do not criticize anyone for having thoughts of these people are different. Do I trust them? Do I not trust them? But how you act on your thoughts is what counts. What your actions are is how you interpret your thoughts, and what you do with them. That's what makes the difference. Comments?
I think it's very difficult in terms of those cultural identities and those factors in the culture we've come to accept most anything culturally, because that's part of just the way that we're now doing things. So whether I have a paya on both sides, and I'm, have a black coat on that's long and a big hat or whatever, or whether my trousers are riding much below standards of what many people would call good taste. Those things have a way of working out. But if you put the word systemic in there, everybody has a different definition of systemic, but that's sort of like here to stay, and necessarily whatever it means, I find that people are going, well, that's just the way it is. We can't change that. We can't do laws. We can expect compliance. We can do it through the courts. And then I think of the example of peaceful protest turning bad.
whether it was when I was a college student or whether it's happening today. Peaceful protest turned bad in Minneapolis after George Floyd. Peaceful protest turned bad in Washington, D.C. when a president basically fomented an insurrection, and that's my opinion, and we could use different words for that, but those are the results. But when you listen carefully, one is bad, and the Ohio legislature last week, I believe, is passing, at least the House passed a law to really clamp down on any violence during a protest, okay? So I'm sure they were being responsive to what happened in Washington, D.C., but then something says, no, it's what happened in Minneapolis that we don't want happening in Ohio. Is that systemic, or is that realizing cultural differences? Because in my mind, both of those hysteric, damaging, violent type protests are not such a good thing. Peaceful protest, whether you're protesting the tragic murder of George Floyd, or whether you're protesting the fact that someone said that the election was stolen, it's still my right as an American to do that. But I guess what I would like to learn more about in critical race theory is what's that systemic piece? How did it happen? And that's the history, which I think this CRT is so rich in. And what are the implications for we as go forward, particularly in resolving something called racism?
And we did not discuss, and that'll probably be a later date, the effect that critical race theory has on laws and effects. The Ohio legislature is one. Not only are they considering that law basically criminalizing peaceful protest, they're also considering, which has been passed in some other states, a law that says if the streets are being blocked by demonstrators and you drive a car through there and hit the demonstrators, you're not held liable for it. They're considered to be trespassers in the street, and the law more or less says you have the right to run over people if they're protesting, which seems totally unbelievable, and yet that law has actually been passed some places, and it is proposed in Ohio. That's the lengths we are going to. And I don't have an answer for that. I don't have an answer for any of this. I just want us to be aware of where we're going and what we're doing, and try to take our actions as our basically considered logical actions as we can. Anyone else? These are all ideas just to stimulate discussion, to stimulate thoughts. We are not pretending to have any answers. All we're asking is that we look at these situations and consider them in a basic, I guess I would say, a prayerful and thoughtful manner. Right. Our closing hymn is 219, "O Hear My People." say, I've got the last picture up here. I wanted to show how I like national parks. Yosemite, Yellowstone, even the Smoky Mountains, on the East Coast, in Maine. There's national parks all around the world. Okeechobee in Florida. Because it's Black History Month, I did a search for black families at national parks. I looked high and low. I looked on Bing. I looked on every place I could find. I could not find one picture in the public domain, and maybe I didn't look far enough, of a black family at a national park. That is something to consider. Is that part of the black culture, not to see the outdoors as a place to visit? Something I would like to encourage. But I did find a picture of a black park ranger. So, and I know I did find pictures of black families at like local parks in their cities, you know, enjoying the outdoors and having picnics, but not at national parks. So I thought that was kind of an interesting commentary. All right, closing words. Go in peace, seeking justice by Jim McGaw. When I say go in peace, I don't mean go in mindless oblivion. When I say go in peace, I don't mean go without challenging yourself or others. When I say go in peace, I don't mean go in utter ease and comfort. When I say go in peace, I mean go in peace seeking justice. I mean go in peace committed to equal rights and opportunities for all. When I say go in peace, I mean go in the peace that is created when, together, we build communities of true solidarity, deep compassion, and fierce, unrelenting love. Go in peace. There's leftover cookies, cakes, chocolate donuts, which I sampled just to make sure they were still good, and they are still good. The water's hot. Does anybody, before I do the last thing, does anybody know what was missing from the Super Bowl besides the Bengals winning? Remember how they make a big deal out of Super Bowl commercials every year? Remember what one of the best ones, in my opinion, is every year? Did you see anything about that this year?
Budweiser?
Budweiser.
Yeah, they had a short commercial.
Did they have one?
Yeah.
I must have missed that then.
A horse hurt his leg or something, had it bandaged. Broke a timber of some sort.
Let's see if this one will play. Horses, dogs, and snow, you can't go wrong. All right, that ends our service. Hope everybody had something to think. Feel free to speak and make any contributions, anything you want to see in the future. And we'll see you next week, I hope.